Hello and welcome to the State Secrets podcast. I'm Brad Christian, Cipher Brief's COO and executive editor. And it's my pleasure to welcome former NSA senior executive and recognized subject matter expert in asymmetric warfare, Mike Driscoll, to the Cipher Brief studio. And I'm proud to introduce Mike as a new Cipher Brief expert, meaning he has signed on for the task of helping us all better understand what's happening in the world and what it all means on the pages of the Cipher Brief every day. Mike, welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me, and I'm excited to be a part of the Cipher Brief team and looking forward to the conversation.
Well, we're excited to have you. You know, the world has sort of never been more complicated, as people say, and it seems to be getting more complicated each day. And really, the only mission the Cipher Brief has is trying to bring some clarity and perspective around these issues. So we do that by talking, to people like yourself. Mike, you're a Navy veteran and you retired recently as a civilian with more than 34 years of technical and senior leadership roles at DoD and the National Security Agency. First, when did you retire? How's that been? And then walk us through, if you wouldn't mind, sort of, your career. Help us understand a little bit more of what you've done.
Yeah, so just to kind of quickly, kind of go through it. I retired last July 30th of 24. Sorry, so the July before last now. It's quickly time goes by, but retired in July of 24. As you said, 34 years combined military civilian experience, finishing up with the National Security Agency. Spent the bulk of my career on the technical side, everything from language to analysis to reporting to collection. I definitely had a breadth of experience, and about 20 plus years of my time was spent focused on counterterrorism and asymmetric problem sets, multiple deployments out into Afghanistan and the Middle East, and all focused on trying to prevent another 9/11 from occurring. Was in some pretty interesting situations over that career, and was able to sort of hone a combination of combining national and tactical intelligence needs, especially relative to support to military operations and working with SF community and conventional forces as well.
I think anyone whose career spanned that time frame that you just described has seen just dramatic, unprecedented change and transformation, both in the missions and what we were doing overseas, but also no doubt in your home organization. Can you talk a little bit about, just share maybe a little bit some of the higher lessons learned that you've kind of, now that you've had a moment to catch your breath after retirement, like what were some of the biggest transformations that you remember or jumped out at you over that period of time?
First and foremost, the use of signals intelligence in support to military operations, and really for things that go beyond corroborating human or informing policy, was incredible. In fact, it was a revolution. It's not even an evolution, and you hear people talk about iterative evolution. At following 9/11, I think NSA's role more than significantly changed. In fact, we became a predominant force and voice in how intelligence was going to be used across the battlefield. And not, obviously, we continue our primary national mission, our national security missions, but the changing role of NSA and how we were partnered with forward military components, other government agencies, et cetera, drastically changed. And it actually got to a point, this is my personal perspective, that I think there became an over-reliance on SIGINT at the cost of other intelligence aspects. And in some ways, it's occurred and happened to our partners and our allies as well. Obviously, the most recent example for me would be, the war in Israel and the surprise attacks by Hamas on 7 October. Largely occurred because of an over-reliance on the exquisite at the expense of other things that were occurring and ongoing that were pretty prevalent, that could have helped Israel prevent 7 October surprise from occurring.
The role of SIGINT, I certainly remember from my career just feeling how at the time, although I wasn't directly involved, feeling just how consequential that it was. When you look at today's world, the advent of OSINT, not the advent, but the increasing use of OSINT and some of the other types of intelligence that you've mentioned there. Do you think that NSA and the intelligence community has moved closer to striking a better balance from the over reliance of SIGINT from where we are today?
I don't know. That's a good question, and the answer I would love for it to be yes, because to me, I actually just had the opportunity to speak at the Citadel recently at their OSINT conference, and I talked extensively about my belief that we're at a key inflection point with OSINT, not just OSINT, but open source as a whole, publicly available information as a whole, and the advent and capability of using artificial intelligence to help us do what the primary shortfall of OSINT and open source over my decades has just been validity of source, and then being able to accept, for a ground commander or a military commander or someone to make a decision based upon open source only. I think we're at a great point now where I believe, again, my recent experience with the Israeli conflict, but as you look at Ukraine, as you look at China, Russia, et cetera, I believe there's a distinct role that OSINT and open source can play to help alleviate those other traditional intelligence disciplines. As we as I mentioned, the over reliance on the exquisite is not just extensive to SIGINT, right? It includes other intelligence disciplines, and I think that where we're moving toward is an ability for open source and OSINT to be used in such a way to alleviate burdens so that those traditional intelligence disciplines can focus on the truly deep, the truly difficult, and the truly needed intelligence needs. And then we can use OSINT open source for indications and warnings in ways that we've been a little more hesitant to do in the past. And I think even going back to the ISIS fighting, so 2015, 2016 timeframe, we saw, increased use of Twitter and social media platforms in ways that really kind of, we won't say it supplanted or was exchanged for, VHF radios, et cetera, because they still exist, but it definitely provided a different way that the adversaries have been using open source. And I think that's the key thing that I think sometimes we fail to truly integrate is understanding how our adversaries have been very successful in use of open source, not even just in the cognitive warfare, the information warfare domain, but even as they've used it as an indications and warning mechanism. And I think that we need to be able to kind of in parallel account for how the adversary use of it through sort of a traditional lens, but also then how they're using it within a gray zone to change mindsets, and in some ways have been fairly effective in changing U.S. mindsets, and not in a good way.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to talk more about the gray zone. I'm excited to kind of get into that a little bit with you because I know that's just an area that you think a lot about. As you know that we do here at the Cipher Brief. Before we leave your career, I know, most things involving NSA are, to put it mildly, on the far side of the sensitive sort of, we don't talk a lot about it kind of spectrum. So I'm not going to ask anything specific, but from your time overseas, were there some notable memories over your career that you're okay to talk and share a little bit about from some of those many trips overseas?
Look, without going into detail of things, the most memorable aspects have always been about the partnerships and relationships that were developed by my forward presence in those locations, and being able to understand a customer's needs at a speed and scale that you're just not going to, no matter how virtual we get, my conversation with you today, right? There is nothing that replaces a face-to-face relationship, and to have had the opportunity to go forward and live in customer space, to get a real good look at what NSA looks like to its customers. And because what that can do then is change the message back to my own headquarters element, to my own leadership, to make sure that we close down information and communication gaps. Because look, the military speaks a different language from the intel community. The intel community speaks a different language from the State Department. And the best way to get over some of these language hurdles is, well, obviously always be as clear as you can be in your messaging, but two, also spend time with your customers and make sure you understand, there's what they need, and then there's what they think they need, and then there's what they want, and those things overlap, and sometimes being able to determine best course of action. I basically got that from being forward and spending that time with them, and whether that was in Afghanistan or in other locations overseas, following 9/11, I would attribute a lot of, or any success I had, to not only the phenomenal teams and colleagues that I got to spend time with, the great leaders I had in the past that I learned from, but also being able to kind of work closely with the customers in that, and then expediting decision based upon that communication strategy. I think had everything to do with my own success.
Was there a lot of friction or tension back at NSA when you were kind of deployed and trying to translate those customer, needs? There's always, friction between headquarters and deployed elements, but don't really ever have a sense of kind of, an organization that is so technical and has so many amazing capabilities like NSA. What was it like trying to kind of convey those like end user from maybe a special operations mission downrange to what folks back home were thinking?
Sometimes it was like swimming, upstream. And, it's funny. I used to joke about this all the time. If I was the target owner or something, of the nature within the NSA construct, and I worked it every single day, somehow when I deployed downrange, evidently I lost memory, or I lost capabilities in a way that I wasn't able to kind of, convey
Yeah.
adequately. Additionally, I'm sort of an aberration in some ways, in some respects, to my career, in the fact that I spent the bulk of my career in the field.
Yeah.
I was hired on at NSA, and I worked at NSA headquarters. But once I was there for a little bit, I PCSed out, and I actually was not. I was in the field the entirety of my career after that. So I think I left NSA headquarters in the summer of 2002, and was never stationed back there. And so it's a very odd way of doing it. And it's always weird when I was mentoring others. I definitely didn't. I would always kind of feel weird telling them that they needed to go to headquarters for a little bit. But I think the nature of the wars that we were faced with, the problem sets that we were faced with, I was down at NSA Georgia, and the focus of those missions there were front center of what
Yeah.
was needed. And so I was able to kind of really grow in my own personal career, but also the missions and the teams that I was working with, because of the role the cryptologic centers played in the conflicts. And so there's that. But as far as messaging going back, I mean, anytime the farther away you're from the flagpole, the more difficult it's going to be
Yeah.
sometimes to get your message across. And so the way I would handle that is either over communicate. I wasn't afraid to go to who I thought the decision point was. At times, I just had to always try to make sure I was right when I did that, and then be prepared for some harder conversations if I wasn't right. And
Yeah.
there were times I wasn't right. So,
Yeah.
but overall, what I found was, and maintained, is NSA, as far as federal entities go, is probably one of the best when it comes to reaction to crisis. And as long as if there's a military campaign, or there's a 4-star, or it makes it a little bit easier to kind of get the machine moving, because NSA is a huge organization. It's when getting the aircraft carrier to turn, so to speak, can take a minute. But once that industrial speed or strength gets pulled into play, there's no other intel agency or entity that can compete, with NSA. And
Yeah.
I think that was always incredible to be a part of something like that. Now, it could get incredibly frustrating too when I didn't think they were moving fast enough. But the key thing is to always make sure you understand what your requirements are. And I think that some people forget that, not just NSA, but the intel community as a whole, I mean, it runs off requirements.
Yeah.
And while we will try to always identify anticipatory requirements, we still need a requirement in order to kind of move move the ball down the field, so to speak. And so I would tell you, my experiences while deployed, I would always overall give my home agency an A when it comes to support and being able to identify what customer needs are and then kind of rally folks around what was needed. Always been frustration points, but the end result was that we ended up outperforming everybody else we were dealing with. So
An A grade is a pretty phenomenal score. So that'll be maybe one of the big takeaways from this conversation. All right, I want to shift a little bit now to more present time because we met you recently when you came down and attended the Cipher Briefs 2025 Threat Conference. And that was a phenomenal couple of days where we talked a lot about, many of the different national security topics that are front and center. But what are the common themes throughout the whole conference this year? And this is a little different than previous 8 years of the conference, was the prevalence of gray zone topics. And it was really a common theme throughout many of the different sessions. And you sat on a specific gray zone panel that dug into, of course, a lot of what we see going on with the Russia-Ukraine war, cognitive issues. We talked a little bit about some experiences that you had that touch on the gray zone. I wonder if you could just give our listeners a really quick sort of a review of what we talked about on that gray zone panel, and then let's expand on that because I want to get into some of those issues that we touched on down there.
Okay, yeah, no problem. One, it was great meeting you guys down there, and of course, I very much enjoyed the conference. Some of the things that I touched on in that panel are still relevant, highly relevant to right now, and that is, I did some lessons learned following my time. I had cause to be in Israel when the 7 October war started, and my wife and I were there, and
you were there already.
Yes, we were there. Yeah. We'd been there for about a year and a half already, and so what was fascinating to me was, and in some ways horrific, was that within 2 days of the war starting, Israel had already lost the information domain. They'd already become behind in the messaging aspect of sort of the hearts and mind concept, and this is despite having an adversary that literally broadcast the horrific action that it had carried out through Telegram and other social media platforms. They massive amounts of video bragging about what they had done and what they were going to do in a way that normally you would, okay, here, this is my enemy. Look at how horrible they are.
Yeah, it was unprecedented, really, what they did.
Absolutely. And then, but within 2 days, the message started changing. And it didn't hurt Hamas that they had their own propaganda machine in Al Jazeera to kind of help them get their message across. And I've been very vocal about, I still don't understand how Qatar and Egypt have gotten off scot-free in some ways regarding this conflict. But at the end of the day, as an American, in the country, I was a little mystified, and maybe, I don't know if it's an age thing or what, but I was very confused at first about what was being broadcast, and more importantly, what Americans or what Westerners were ready to consume and take as truth that was absolutely false. And let me be clear here: this is not about politics, and I'm no apologist for Israel's own role in sort of helping create the situation. But at the end of the day, to have Americans marching or protesting on behalf of a very evil organization, and I'm not pulling any punches when my description of Hamas is they are in some ways as bad, if not worse, than ISIS, and the fact that there are people, that are Americans, that are Germans, that are British, that believe in a Western mindset or have a Western mindset or Western government that could buy into this message. What was going on, in our own societies that made them susceptible to the messaging as it occurred? What weren't we doing very well in that regard? And I'm definitely not picking on the Israelis because they were dealing. I think that they're often not understood in what they were dealing with at scale in a
Yeah.
way that as Americans we can't really understand, because even 9/11, you would have had to have 30 cities, 30 9/11s
Yeah. As a
across the United
comparison.
States to have the same parity
Yep.
um, with what the Israelis are dealing with, and for that matter, the Israelis that that I had to meet with and work with, we're talking 50-60% of their own workforce population directly impacted
Yep.
familially or familiarly with others and what had occurred, and that is something that had its own struggles and complexities that they had to work through in order to get, excuse me, in order to get where they wanted to get. And so in the early days, trying to figure out what they needed, what they wanted was part of my job. But the other thing was trying to convince them that there's 12 million people on the planet that speak Hebrew.
Yeah.
Yet about 90% of their messaging was in Hebrew. And
Yeah.
I think the one population on the planet that they didn't need to convince that Hamas was bad and what they had done was bad was the Israeli populace. And so
Yeah.
a lot of my conversations with my partners was, hey, how do we get this great media messaging you have going out? How do you get that out in English, or for that matter, Russian or French, or something other than Hebrew, because you're kind of missing the boat, and every day you're falling further and further behind in the messaging conflict. And in fairness to them, regardless of what people think, Israel's a nation of laws,
Hmm.
and key among those things that they are concerned about are victims' rights. And so the things that Israel would have had to been willing to do in the information domain, they couldn't do until they talked to the victims and had the legal reviews, et cetera. That's the one downfall of any of this gray zone activity, is that democracies will always, at least initially, be behind in a lot of different ways because of autocrats don't need to worry about the feelings, and they don't need to worry about civil liberties. And so they can kind of move, something that might take us 60 days to figure out an attribution. They're figuring it out in 60 minutes, and they're firing mission. And so I think,
Or even less than 60 minutes. I mean,
yeah,
sometimes it's
exactly.
down to seconds and minutes, and these messages are propagating.
Yeah, and I think
That's
that's one of the things when we talk about gray zone, especially as a constitutional republic or democracy, is how do we build in or bake in policy changes that are required for us to be able to be effective in there. Because at the end of the day, I think you know last thing on Israel before we can kind of transition is you know the United States hasn't faced an existential threat in a long time.
yeah.
And I'm not going. I'll draw the line at using the word hypocrisy, but I will say I think it's interesting that what we have been willing to do since 9/11, um, not facing an actual existential threat. But if you looked at you know Ramadi or Fallujah, I mean, we rebelized those cities in with intent to pre 2011 Iraq and then post 2011 Iraq with the ISIS fight, in order to kind of meet our national security objectives, and we weren't facing an existential threat. Yet we're going to turn around and point fingers at the Israelis on what they were doing, to try and defend country. Because if you ask the average Israeli as to whether they're better off right now than they were 2.5 years ago, removing the horrible hostage situation and the deaths on that 7 October, they're actually, from a physical perspective, they would tell you they're better off, because Hezbollah has been decapitated.
Hmm.
Iran has been shown to be in a lot of, we always get accused of being a paper tiger, but I would tell you, if I'm Hamas or Hezbollah or even the Shia militant groups in Iraq or the Houthis, I'd be taking a hard look at how much the Iranians actually did or did not help
Yeah.
in that war. And the fact is that they got, not only were they shown to not be a great ally and supporter, they also were shown to be a paper tiger at the end of the 12-day war. And
Yeah.
so I think that you talk about key marketing or key information domain. Where are we on our messaging to show how horrible Iran has been as a supporting power, to these proxies? And that should be something that we're heavy-handed in as far as information attribution.
You
Um,
mean for our own, for domestic consumption is what you're talking about for
Well,
Americans.
domestic and for
Yeah.
that matter, foreign,
Or
however you want to do it. I mean,
yeah.
the beauty of social media, we may be aiming it domestically, but we're the United States. Anything that we're putting out is going to be international as
This is a
well.
really this is a really vexing problem though, if we talk about, this dynamic that, you mentioned with people protesting, in support of Hamas or demonstrating in support of Hamas here in America. This kind of thing is going to happen again. I've often joked sort of offline here at the Cipher Brief, when we first kind of started seeing the misinformation, disinformation trends some years ago. I've joked in the past, that we'll leave it unnamed. We'll say a major American adversary could deploy their military to, say, the west coast of the United States, deploy half of their airborne infantry forces into a major western state, and if certain messaging platforms got the message out first that America's not been invaded, it's just they're here for humanitarian help, or they're helping with a earthquake relief or something. There's a sizable percentage of Americans that would say, "Yeah, that's true," and there would be another percentage that was like, "Wait a minute, no, this is not good. We've been invaded," and that seems to be this weird dynamic that our country in particular has. There's people that are just willing to believe things that you and I would laugh at, scoff at, and say, how this is so absurd. How can you possibly believe this? But these people represent sizable percentages and they sway influence and they all these things. Like how are you thinking about this, when we put our forward-looking lens on? Because this is a vexing problem. The
Well,
prominence of our adversaries using social media to include investing in sponsored posts and things that they've done in the past. They can propagate messages so quickly. How is the right way for the United States to be thinking about it? There's so much distrust in government and media and what would previously be considered sort of like respected voices and authoritative voices. Like how do we chop this up a little bit and start thinking? Because I know you think about these kind of things a lot. So, and
I
I know
think
you don't have a crystal ball, but how do we get ahead of this problem before the next one happens?
well the well, so I'll hit one thing real quick on you nailed something that bothered me very greatly during the onset of the Israeli conflict, and the things that concern me from an American perspective and what could happen to us to directly hit your point is the information warfare loss piece was something that greatly concerned me, and how quickly to your, I mean, great analogy on certain portions of our population in a sliding scale believing this or that. But the other one was tunnel warfare, right? And when I look at those are just two things that I hit very hard, and then of course unmanned or uncrewed systems being the three primary things that concern me greatly about how the United States would respond to something similar if it occurred. But it starts and stops with education. Are we raising our children to love America?
Yeah.
Are we raising our children to understand our own form of government, how we got to where we are, why we are the way we are? I think. Well, I told you a short fib. I do have to bring one aspect of the Israeli piece, and that's what a lot of the things that we weren't tracking as Americans, if you weren't there, was that Israel was dealing with civil internal issues at a scale they had never seen before prior to 7 October, which I'm sure that played into the mindset of the Hamas folks as to choose why they attacked when they attacked, was, because of the reactions to Netanyahu and other right-wing sides of the government. You had some pretty large protest going on through that country, which the Jewish population or the Israeli population had never seen before. It was new
Yeah.
to them. Whereas the United States was literally born out of civil disobedience, and we were very familiar with that construct. It was definitely something new that they were dealing with. But it goes back to my point about why were Americans and Westerners so quick to believe the disinformation and the outright fabrication of fact that was going on from the social media post and from Al Jazeera and other media sources. Why was our own media so quick to grasp? And in fairness, the United States we have made mistakes, which doesn't help, in the trust category. And, but our responses are also not great sometimes. They're either late to the party on how we should respond, or um, our strategic long-term strategies might not have been best result. I think if you look at how the United States responded to Snowden, and to other uh, really bad leaks that frankly were danger to, had grave damage to our national security, and greatly aided our adversaries. I think we actually became too risk averse when, to me, that was a great inflection point for us to maybe taken a play out of the Chinese playbook, which is not care to some extent, and that we embolden and enable our own cyber operations to effectively message and strategically message in a different way. We chose to not do that, and that's a different conversation. We can explore that at some other point, but at the end of the day, I do believe it starts and stops with the education of our youth, and I mean, we don't even teach civics for the
Yeah.
most part anymore, and more importantly, take a look at most history books in the public school system and tell me what you find on 9/11. If you find a
Interesting.
paragraph about just some guys that flew planes into buildings, you're lucky.
Yeah.
And I think that's part and parcel to what also the problems that we're facing, and why we have a population of the 30 and under crowd that's so quick to assume we're wrong.
Yeah.
It's weird because I'm sure you've had the benefit. If you've ever lived overseas, there are a reason there are myriad reasons why people all over the world want to come here.
Yeah.
And I think that we don't truly appreciate it, and more importantly, that comes from a lack of education, and a lack of understanding. And if we're going to teach, I don't want to use the word self hate, but if we're definitely going to teach our own children that America is something it's not. I mean, you don't want to overinflate, but you also don't want to not give credit where credit's due. If I had a place to choose where I would say that was, we need to be a little more fair to ourselves when it comes to the education of as we bring our kids up. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
There's almost never been a place I've traveled anywhere, certainly in some of the more rougher parts of the world that you've been to, where you don't immediately, in a one-on-one conversation, realize that you as an American bring, hope and a level of positivity to a part of the world that's just not used to it. And so I verbally fight people, all the time when you start this, like, we should be embarrassed to be American kind of thing. I definitely totally agree with you. And it does start at home. It's, this kind of thing where you're never going to really be able to rely on, institutions, I think, to do this kind of education. I want to ask you, because you said something that just made me think for a moment. We recently, on a prior episode of the State Secrets podcast, talked to Sean Chenoweth. Suzanne talked to Sean Chenoweth. And of course, his title, I think, if I get it right, is Director of Cognitive Advantage at the White House. And he talked about this concept of a kill web instead of a kill chain, and then really kind of understanding that from the government's perspective, you know, you need to start to think about this cognitive domain and this information space almost as an ongoing battle where you might wake up in the morning being in a relatively safe spot, lose the initiative, be strategically, put back on your back foot, regain the initiative, and then by the end of the workday, be back to sort of a normal sort of status in this conflict. But the way he characterized it, and I may be getting that a little bit wrong, but the way he characterized it was this almost all the time, 24/7 state of mind where you're in a constant fight for, you know, dominance or advantage or victory in this information space. Is that what we need to sort of shift to from a, government or large institution perspective? Because it certainly still feels like we're not there yet.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I do believe that, you know, regardless of who's in charge, or who's here at this time or another, I do believe that we've got to change our machine, so to speak. One, uh, if anyone thinks that we're going to go through this without reliance upon the private industry, uh, they're not paying attention to what's really going on. More importantly, as we heard in the Cipher brief conference, the how much of the AI development is being done without the government that's an incredible metric that I don't think most people are understanding. And while you know, while there are various things that can come into play, I think I would always prefer someone who has sworn an oath to defend me. Uh, to me, it matters, and again, that could be a difference in generations, et cetera. But the thing that I have always found interesting is that the average American or average person, frankly, more than happy to believe Apple and Google, when they say this, that, or the other. But the very people who have sworn and served their life to defend those folks that get the biggest doubt, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that we are absolutely going to have to transform how we do things, and everything from we talk about we're not it's not a matter of whether we're losing or not, but the things that trip us up are we mentioned it earlier. How long does it take us to do attribution? Right, we
Hmm.
have an attribution lag that might take 60 days to get to 95%, and the adversary, to your point, I said 60 minutes. Hell, it could be 60 seconds.
Yeah.
That they're doing what they do. We have become so risk averse, and I tell people in my retirement speech, I talked about the operational space and decision space that I had as a GS-12 in 2002 in many ways exceeded what my decisional space was as a senior executive retiring from the agency because of mistakes that we made, right? But then just the speed and scale at which information and intelligence gets put out there, and then the risk that inevitably comes across, with that. But I think that friction's where growth lives, and we're absolutely going to have to just get used to being uncomfortable 24 hours a day. I remind people that all the time, any chance I get, that we didn't beat the Soviet Union by focusing only on mainland Russia. We beat the Soviet Union globally by focusing on what the Russians were doing in Africa, what they were doing trying to do in South America, what they were doing across Europe. And I think that since the National Defense Strategy dropped in 2018, we have not done a great job of building the mindset. Forget the machine or the systems; it's the mindset, and we need to figure out how we can create living policy that adjusts on. I won't say on the fly, but it definitely allows us to make our shrink our decision space. And
Yeah.
the thing is, the great thing about the United States, and for that matter, our other Western allies, is that we'll always fall behind in the early days of a conflict, especially autocrats, et cetera, because of their centralized decision process and how quickly they can do things, and their lack of care for civil liberties and human rights, et cetera. But historically, we've shown that once we all start rowing in the same direction, even if we're not rowing at the same speed, we tend to not just catch up, but we pass very quickly anything that we're behind. It's just, hey, how do we do that? And I do believe, going back to the conversation about the role that OSINT or open source is going to be able to play to relieve burden, I think just as importantly in that is using AI to help shrink our decision space to seconds and not days or months. But part of that too is rebalancing our risk aversion, and being a little more comfortable with the risk, because that escalation phobia that we have of, oh my gosh, if we sink this militia boat, does that lead us to World War III? And I would tell you what I saw, at least from the Russians, is we took some pretty significant risk in the build up to the invasion. Not even talking post invasion, but to what we were willing to release publicly to prevent the Russians from being able to take some fabricated moral high ground to save Russians from Nazis in East Ukraine, and it didn't damage us anyway, it didn't hurt us anyway, and it actually helped us prevent the Russians from being able to take advantage in some ways. And I think that we need to figure out, hey, how do we do that more often? And the beauty of AI, it's going to help use open source at a speed and scale that we still not are even comfortable with, to prevent uh, the despots and the autocrats and the ne'er do wells from being able to take that information advantage. We just have to, we're kind of in our own way with that. That we have to have the policy in place that truly allows fast forwarding to an actual physical fight, integration on the spear point in the way that we're seeing the Ukrainians do it. I mean, that's integration in its purest form, and it's deeply uncomfortable for people. But guess what? They're facing an existential threat, and the decision process changes greatly when you're in that situation. And so, what we always want to do is, hey, how do we prevent us from even getting into the existential threat in the first place? But as we look across, to me, the gray zone, gray zone activities, it's not about whether gray zone activities will start the next war. To me, it's more about gray zone will decide who is too exhausted to fight the next war. And whether that's iterative or asymmetric, it depends on your perspective on what you're used to dealing with. But since I retired, I've had the opportunity to work with Green Berets and USASOC, and one of the things that I'm deeply involved in is, hey, how do we actually do integration, and it not just be some cool buzzword that might get you a few dollars here and there, because integration, if you're really doing integration, it is not a comfortable place, because you're asking people from across disciplines and sometimes cross authorities to do things that we're not used to doing. But we have great lessons learned. If what we did since 9/11 and multiple conflicts in different areas, we know how to do it. It's just getting people moving in that right direction. And a center part of that is, hey, how do we make private industry more comfortable with us on the government side, and vice versa, as we kind of move forward? Does that hopefully that makes sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I'm a little bit biased, but I think the Green Berets are a perfect force to be able to work through some of those integration sort of topics. Well, Mike, you've given us so many things to think about, and if you're listening to this conversation, a lot of what Mike's talking about, people on the Cipher Reef have been saying now for a while, that the next conflict, whether we're in it already or not, is really going to be dominated by a lot of these gray zone, asymmetric, and most importantly, cognitive issues. So encourage you to listen, to this, and then stay close to the Cipher Brief. We're spending a lot more time these days talking about these issues. We've started something called the Gray Zone Group specifically to just kind of look at this more. And Mike will no doubt be hearing a lot more from you, as part of that, and as these things come up. So we appreciate you taking the time today. The newest Cipher Brief expert, Mike Driscoll, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to Mike, and you're going to hear a lot more from him in the future.
Thanks for having me.